Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Ryan O'Neill.
Well, it's not often you get to talk to one of your personal heroes. You should see the look on his face. We have Hornell High School history teacher Mark Smith in the studio with us this morning. He's part of the Civil War reenactment and the Battle of Lane Mills coming up once again, so we're very glad to have Mark Smith with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Brian. And, you know, when it comes to personal heroes, aren't you supposed to be younger than your personal hero? And since you're considerably older than me, we'll just forget that and set that aside.
A year or so. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Okay, you're a history teacher at Hornell High School. You teach 8th grade.
Yes, I am.
And you're a Civil War reenactor.
That's correct.
Starting out with the Civil War reenactment.
Yeah.
Do you find that teaching history at Hornell High School helps you in your Civil War preparation for the characters that you play?
To a certain extent, definitely. It gives you the ability to be more in-depth in your answers, because we're more an educational group than we are just a pure reenacting group. So the knowledge I brought to reenacting as a reenactor, as a teacher, was helpful. However, on the other side of that, being a reenactor has taught me so much more that I take into the classroom on a regular basis.
Why so?
Because the Civil War is such a complicated, it really truly was a complicated 4 years of the United States history, and every day you meet, every reenactment you meet somebody new who has a piece of information you'd never heard before. It's actually enriching as a person.
You know, Kevin Dorn, who used to host this show, was not a fan of President Abraham Lincoln, believe it or not. And that's the kind of thing you got to carefully explain.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin Dorn was anti-slavery and anti-segregation. His problem with Lincoln was the executive orders.
Yes.
And the emergency executive orders that Lincoln issued during wartime.
Yes.
What do you make of Lincoln's EOs there, his executive orders?
I think Lincoln was stuck in a realm where he was at war. That gave him, as commander-in-chief of the military, the ability to command the military. And to do that is never fully defined in the Constitution. So he had to figure out what he was going to say, or how he was going to do it. How does this define to emergency powers? And so he took them. I kind of agree with Kevin Dorn in the fact that I think he went too far.
Lincoln.
Yeah. Lincoln, have you ever seen the movie Lincoln?
No, you've yet to see that.
There's a brilliant scene where Daniel Day-Lewis, who played Abraham Lincoln, announces that I'm President of the United States, clothed in immense power. And I think that really kind of takes Lincoln to the extreme he was at. At the same time, he was dealing with a situation that I don't think the Founding Fathers had considered. The United States was at war with itself. And I don't think they had been able to fully define what that would mean at all.
Mark, do you find out anything that surprises you about the North or anything that surprises you about the South in your Civil War history?
The issue of slavery is incredibly complex from the beginning. But by the time we got to the Civil War, the United States had polarized itself so that there was a definite North and a definite South. And so when the war broke out, there's a lot of theories, and I'm about to annoy many people who've talked to me in the past. The issue of the Civil War was slavery, really from beginning to end.
It's not just a state rights thing. It is states' rights, but the big issue for the states' rights is slavery. And that's the catch. There's conversations about, well, the industrial North was putting down the agrarian South. But the truth is, if you read the secession papers of every state that left, they all mention specifically the right to own slaves. They don't all specifically talk about the states' rights. And if you look at the progression of the war, the government that was created by the Articles of Confederacy, the government that the Confederacy had created, was actually a very centralized government that was constantly at war with the states, even within their own confederacy. Did I answer the question? Yes, you did.
Oh, good.
Going back to the founders, if we could.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the big mistake there was legalizing slavery. Do you find what history can you tell us about in terms of the founders, in terms of
who are the pro-slavery founders and how many of them were anti-slavery? Do you have a sense of that?
If what I have read is true, when they were writing the Declaration of Independence, where no notes were really kept, afterthoughts by the Founding Fathers was that there was a large argument about a part of the Declaration of Independence that Jefferson himself had written in the lists of things that King George was doing that was wrong. And one of them was, and I'm not going to quote it right, but he has allowed a people to be stripped from their homeland and sold as property in a foreign shore. He was basically saying that one of the things that England had done wrong was establish slavery within our country. That part was taken out because South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia threatened to leave if it stayed in, and we needed a unified nation. So pro-slavery and anti-slavery was a very touchy subject. Benjamin Franklin had led the first anti-slavery movement in the United States and was against slavery, but he allowed it to remain. And I believe the thought was, it's an evil, but the first evil is the British. Let's remove ourselves from the British, then we'll tackle the other things that young countries have to tackle. My problem is I always felt they put it on a back burner till it absolutely blew up in their face. Which
way
was
too long, and then solving the segregation problem, waiting until 1964 to get that taken care of, another problem,
and another continuous problem.
Too far delayed.
We're a very young country, though. I mean, we're 230 years old, or about that. When you talk to England, you're talking to a country that goes back to the remains of the Roman Empire. When you talk to France, you're talking about a country to the Roman Empire. Germany's a young country, but Prussia, which is where Germany came out of, is a rich history. We're relatively new, and we're finding our way, and we're doing it badly because all young children do things badly first, and they learn their lessons. We get better, I think, a little bit every day. In order to form a more perfect union from the Constitution. We're not perfect. We know that. We acknowledge that, and we try to undo that all the time.
I want to get back to the history of wars because I know you have a great history of World War II and World War I, but I do want, and other wars, but I want to get to the reenactment.
Yeah.
Battle of Lane Mills. Tell us about that, and tell us about the Union and the Confederacy and how that's going to play out, the dates, and what the public needs to know.
Battle of Lane's Mill, up at Lane's Cider Mill. We do it every year. This is, I think, our fourth year. We took a year off last year, but we did it 3 years, and then this year will be our fourth year up there. It's June 2nd and 3rd, so it's right up this upcoming weekend. We're going to start Friday. We're going to have school days. We have, I think it's 7 schools bringing students up to go through a series of stations and learn what it was like to be a Civil War soldier, what it was like to eat on the march, what it was like to fire weapons and how they lived. We also have civilians showing what the civilians did in the field or how they dealt with home life. But for the public, we're open 9:30 Saturday and Sunday in the morning, $3 per person, children under 5 free. The neat thing about this is we only charge because we have to be able to put this on. We're a nonprofit organization, so really the $3 is just sort of to recoup what we invested into the process. So if you buy a ticket on Saturday for $3 and keep a hold of it, you can come into Sunday for free. We just want to kind of get the populace up there. It's a great day. It's a great weekend. There's battles, and there's sutlers, which are people who sell Civil War era replicas, not true antiques. But if you want to get yourself a dress or a uniform, there are actually people out there selling it, and then you can walk through the camps and ask us questions. Because one thing reenactors really love doing is they love talking about the Civil War. They love talking about what they're doing and what the stance was of the soldiers who fought back then.
In the Civil War reenactments that you take part in, and I should have asked this years ago to Annabelle. Dr. Spencer Annabelle's been on this show numerous times over the years, talking about the Battle of Lane's Mill, but before it comes up. When someone gets shot in a Civil War reenactment, do you have like the blood caps? Do you know ahead of time, or is it all spontaneous? How's that work out?
There's actually, it's kind of a funny conversation that happens around the campfire all the time. There have been reenactments that are very large. The reenactment of Gettysburg, for example, when you have 5 or 6 or 7,000 reenactors crossing the field for Pickett's charge, and to get a sense of realism, everybody would get a number. And as you walk across the field, a captain would yell out a number, and when your number is called, you drop. But for the most part, there's no blood capsules. We don't go in for that much realism. However, at the same time, There are members of reenactors who will have fake bandages with red dye on it. Dr. Annabelle does an incredible medical impersonation where he removes a leg and it looks very realistic, but at the same time he uses that as an educational piece. Really, the fun part is I've always said, when do you die in a reenactment? It's when you run out of ammunition, or you're just tired of walking, or you're really near some shade and you can just drop underneath a tree and watch the rest of the reenactment.
Do you do the accents of the person that you're portraying?
I don't. I do from time to time, but I'm not good at a Southern accent. I'm not consistent, so I don't. There's a difference between historical reenactments and historical interpretation. Historical interpretation is a person would research one individual and learn their entire history, where they were from, where they were wounded, where they died, what their life history was. And at that point in time, they try to dress like them, they try to be able to answer questions like them, and then the accents will come in pretty solid. My accent, quite honestly, comes from Myrtle Beach and years of Myrtle Beach with my family, so it's not Georgian at all. And we portray the 21st Georgia.
I worked briefly in Georgia in radio.
Yeah?
Nights at B95-1 in Macon.
I don't know where Macon is.
Macon is 1 hour and 10 minutes directly south of Atlanta.
Okay, all right. The 21st Georgia was formed from counties around Atlanta.
Okay.
Historically.
Very interesting conversation we're having this morning with Hornell High School history teacher Mark Smith. Before we get back to the reenactments, I did have another history question.
Mm-hmm.
Those who learn from history, what gets repeated and what does not get repeated in a war? For example, what did they learn from the Civil War that maybe they did not do, the U.S. Army when it came to World War I, World War II, any of those wars? Are there any big lessons that come out of the Civil War as far as military knowledge goes?
Well, the interesting thing about the Civil War is it began as the last, I'd call, polite war. That idea that at the end of the day we stop fighting, and if you have a friend across the way, you could go visit him. But by the end of the war, the Confederacy was so beaten down that they were changing tactics. At the beginning of the war, you would see a very Napoleonic war where armies marched across fields directly at each other in the open. But with the increase in technology in muskets, with rifled muskets, so the ammunition went farther and much more accurately. By the end of the war, the Confederacy was so desperate they changed tactics and they dug trenches and they built fortifications. The other interesting thing about the Civil War is it was a war that was viewed by Europe. Europeans came and joined, not in the war itself, but as observers. They watched these battles, and they learned nothing from them. So the beginning of World War I, Europe began that war very much like a Napoleonic War. They didn't learn the lessons. But by the end of that war, as people who study history know, World War I ends up in the trenches in France. And they end up rebuilding exactly what they thought was, when they saw the trenches that the Confederates were digging, they thought, what a ridiculous thing that is. Why would you do that? And by the end of World War I, actually really by the end of the first year of World War I, they're digging the same trenches. They're doing the same thing. That's the big change that comes out. What does America learn by that? They learn initially static, defendable positions were really helpful, but that's going to change with World War II. A war is always evolving.
We're talking with Hornell history teacher Mark Smith, who's taking part in the upcoming battle of Lane Mills. Wondering, when you look, do you ever recreate other battles? The Battle of Fort Sumter or the Battle of Bull Run or Gettysburg. Do any of those? When we go and see Lane Mills this weekend, do we see anything from those battles?
We have in the past done that. You can go to reenactments and see the actual battles. A lot of reenactments will say, okay, this battle is going to be the battle of whatever. But when you go to a reenactment our size, we're a smaller reenactment. So really what you try to do is you try to give something that when you see the actual battle, you get an idea of what the battles were like. It's got to be interesting for the public. It's got to be interesting for reenactors. One of the worst things you can do with a reenactor is put him in the middle of a field and have him stand and shoot his gun over and over and over, shoot his rifle over and over and over again. It actually gets boring. But to be honest, to observe that, to be someone on the sideline as a public and just watch people stand, it gets boring. So we try to mix it up. The closest we've come is the 150th Gettysburg. We reenacted Pickett's Charge. Not nearly at the scale that was done in Gettysburg that year or in truly Gettysburg. But we did a huge artillery duel back and forth, and then the Confederates marched at fixed positions that the Union had and were repulsed. But really, at smaller reenactments, what they'll do is they'll say, okay, here's the scenario today, and they'll allow the Confederates to win one day, and they'll let the Union win the next day. And they try to do something to make it interesting, to keep it moving.
Talking to Hornell High School history teacher Mark Smith. Going to take a quick break. When we come back, I have a few more questions about the Civil War, such as, do you have a favorite general or favorite Civil War character? Stay with us.
McCourt's Auto Collision on State Route 36 just south of Canastillo is a full-service collision shop offering not just collision work, but also paint work. McCourt's has a 24-foot frame straightener with 3-dimensional measurement. McCourt's accepts all insurance companies and can work with you on any deductible you may have. At McCourt's, they work for your interest and your benefit, not the insurance companies. All work is fully warranted and they offer a free loaner car. McCourt's Auto Collision, State Route 36 in Canastillo, where customer satisfaction is always number one. Phone 607-698-9900.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn, who also services a station in Baltimore, Maryland, where it's really bad flooding today.
Yeah, they got hammered last night, Brian. A frontal boundary which stalled out just north of them more or less acted as a conduit for shower and thunderstorm activity. They had very warm, moist air moving up from the south in advance of subtropical storm Alberto, cool air coming down from the north. So what happened was we had these huge thunderstorms develop in that area yesterday with lots of heavy rain, lots of lightning, and they didn't move out of the region. Some areas, especially around Ellicott City, which had horrific flooding 2 years ago, they had 10 inches of rain yesterday, and it led to more flooding, actually worse than what took place 2 years ago. So there's lots of problems in Maryland. I had wife's friends contacting us last night because they couldn't get home because they were trapped. They wanted to know when the rain was going to end. For us, we're a little further north. We're going to be seeing that boundary kind of move away from us today, but it's still close by. So we're going to be partly sunny with the risk of a shower or thunderstorm around 85 for our Memorial Day. Sun came up this morning at 5:38. It'll set at 8:38 tonight. We have 15 hours of daylight. We'll add about another 15, 20 minutes to that before the days start getting shorter next month. Tonight, partly cloudy, 60. Sunshine and pleasant tomorrow with high pressure building in. We're about 80 to 85. Clear, cooler, 55 tomorrow night. And then pleasant for Wednesday. Lots of sunshine and 80 to 85, Brian.
Thanks, Rob.
You got it, sir. Have a good one today.
See ya.
See ya.
Back with Hornell history teacher Mark Smith. Teaches 8th grade history and he's taking part in the Civil War reenactment this weekend in Canastillo. We can hear those booms up here every year.
I'm sure you can.
You can hear those. Is that cannons I'm hearing?
That's probably cannon. Doc Annabelle's cannon is pretty thunderous.
Yeah, I guess so. You hear the boom.
Yeah.
Boom. And the first thought always is, it's not hunting season. What the heck was that? Do you have a favorite general or favorite Civil War historical character?
General Longstreet.
How come?
Longstreet is an interesting character in that his life is interesting. He was friends with Ulysses S. Grant before the war. He was best man at Grant's wedding. They were friends, and then they went separate ways. Longstreet was one of two generals that Lee really counted on early in the war, Stonewall Jackson and Longstreet. The difference is Jackson was very quick-moving and I think really kind of reckless. Longstreet was one of the few generals who, with a full battalion, with 5,000 men, would actually train with the whole battalion. So when Longstreet decided he was going to attack someone, he did it wonderfully. It was a solid... I always say, if you need someone to punch in the middle of a field, you get James Longstreet to do that. It was an impressive character that way. And I always say that when you see that moment, or you hear that about that moment at Pickett's charge on the third day of Gettysburg, when Longstreet looked at Lee and said, "There's no 15,000 men that can take that hill, that can do this attack properly," because he tried to refuse that attack. he wasn't speaking of a guy who was whining or was tired of the war. He was speaking as an expert who understood this is how you mass large numbers of men and effectively use them. And Longstreet said, we're not going to win this battle, and they didn't. He did everything he could to win it, but he knew it wasn't going to happen. The other thing I like about Longstreet is when the war is over, he went, we may have made a mistake. And he became a Republican in the South, which was hated. A white Republican in a South that was mostly Democratic back then was seen as a traitor. He then wrote a book where he stated on the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee was wrong to order the attack, which made him hated even more because after the war, Lee became even greater in the estimation of everybody in the country, even the North. So you don't criticize General Lee. But he stayed by his guns, and he stayed with what he believed in. And so he was a Republican for the rest of his life. He was actually refused. They did, every year the armies would get together and sort of toast what they've done. This is something traditional military men have done forever. And Longstreet wasn't invited for the first 20 years. It was only a couple years before he passed away they finally invited him in. And when he walked in the room, he was given a standing ovation. He'd been forgiven. Enough time had passed. But I've always found him to be a fascinating individual.
What do you make of the modern day, Antifa movement of tear down the statues?
Good for you. Good question. This is a dangerous answer. I believe that the statues that were erected in areas that make sense should be left alone. Lee was a Virginian. He lived in Richmond at the end of the war until he went to the Washington College, which is now Washington Lee College. And so the statue of Lee in Richmond makes sense for me. There's also a Confederate statue in, I want to say it's like South Dakota.
Oh, they have them in New York City.
The thing is, though...
A street named after.
But if I could say, South Dakota wasn't a state during the Civil War.
Right.
There's no one from South Dakota who fought the Civil War. There's no great South Dakotan unit who fought in the Civil War. So at that point in time, now I question, why is that Confederate statue there? That's going to be my answer. So I think they need to be left alone where they make sense. I think when they're set up in places like South Dakota or Washington State, they don't make sense to me. And so therefore, if you want to remove them, if you find them offensive, that's fine, because as a historian, I think history belongs where it belongs. I've always enjoyed the fact that the National Parks Service, when this began, stated that any memorials set up anywhere in any of their parks for the Civil War will not be touched, because all of them are memorials of people who fought on those battlefields.
Okay, we've got the Civil War reenactment coming up this weekend, Battle of Lane Mills and Canisteo. Any final thoughts, Mark Smith?
I would love it if the entire population came out. It's different every year. It's fun every year. The Lane family invites us to their land, and they're just wonderful people. They're going to have a small eatery set up, for a small fee. You can eat there, so you can spend the whole day. A lot of people tend to show up just for the battle. I don't advise just showing up for the battle. A lot of stuff happens through the day and a lot of conversation. It's a great weekend. Gates open again at 9:30 in the morning, and they'll stay open until about 4:30 in the afternoon. $3 a person. Saturday and Sunday, I hope to see everybody there. And I just want to say Happy Memorial Day to all the men and women who serve this country.
Thank you so much for coming in.
And thank you for having me.
It's AM 1480 WLEA Hornell.